Hey guys, Christic here. So today I'm going to be going into my part 12 of user services series. And specifically, what I'm going to be doing today is expanding on our repositories so that they can suit an expansion of our models. Now, at the moment, this repository specifically works with our iEntity models, and then the user repository works with those that are an iUser entity. So, what I wanted to work on is building a repository that would also work with other types, things that we can also layer other things onto. But more importantly, what I'm looking for is expanding those objects. Now, the entity that I'm looking at right now, I'm thinking of is our company entity that we've been working with. And I'd like to add in a new feature for adding employees. That employees feature will take users who are in the system and add them into a collection of employees that that company holds. Okay. Now we're not going to work on the model specifically today. That'll come in two more videos. But most importantly, what we're going to work on is expanding the repository model today. So let's get started. So there's a few features that we have to think about. Bringing down one level of a repository is not complicated, but it does require some thinking of what your aim is. So the base level repository looks something like this. Now, when we look at what, for example, you'll see there's a few errors here. Obviously, we have our T key, and a T key doesn't exist here. So what we're actually going to be looking for is something that's a little bit more like T, uh, like an entity. So I can do a find based on an entity, but I can also do a find on other types of parameters. Now, your find is quite important because what I'm going to show you here, I'll just throw it in into here, for example. Um, the way the DB context looks something up is they may do something like this. So if I look up find, I have a few different methods of doing this. Now, if you look at the way this works, it says params object, it's a nullable object, and it's an array of nullable objects, and it's also potentially null. So the key values are what's important here. The key values in a joiner table, like the employee entity will be, because it'll have a company ID and a user ID. Those two together become a composite key. That composite key is very important for us to compare on the database to say, okay, I can't have more than one of those. In other words, if I push an employee on there, there's not going to be a duplicate of those things, so they'll also be indexed. So when we think about how that works, um, the context, what it does is it looks at how the key is actually declared on the system or in your configuration. So it'll be like has key, and I'll demonstrate that when I actually get to building the models. But the goal ultimately here is to offer an opportunity that also uses this object nullable array. So before I get too deep into that, I'm going to implement it, but I wanted to explain why we're going to do what we're doing next. So let's do this here. So what I'm looking for, I'm going to offer a find that is find by the entity, but I'm also going to offer one that is exactly the same declaration here or interface as we use in the context. So there's that. The next thing that I'm going to do is something that looks a little bit more like this. Now, what we have is an add, all right, an add with a new entity, and the other side of this is an entity that's sort of coming in from a post operation on a control. So we create a new instance of an entity that goes in. The other data that's coming in from a post, let's say it's a post body or something on an API, like in our case we're using JSON document. These two comes in, I can merge those two, copy from one entity to another, and then complete the add. Okay, so there's a couple features that you're going to see that are a little different than normal. Now the other one is update, not with an ID, because remember at this point I'm actually working at just one level above the data context. Okay, and this means that I can also add some business logic at this point, but the key is that when I use this one specifically, it's going to be used in the context of something like, again, it's like I'm going to pull an entity from the database, pull another one from somewhere else, and merge the two. Okay, and if that seems a little confusing, you'll see how it comes through at the end. Now, the next one that I'm doing here is I still need an update that's just the entity. Okay, so that's going to be important. The other thing that I want to look at is I can delete that. And let's see, I'll delete that. I don't need an exists with a key, but I do need an exists with a T. So once again, I can say, here's my entity. Go and see if that entity exists. And all it does in this case, again, is it's just going off and comparing those two keys. So it's looking at, let's say, company ID and user ID, and says, okay, do these things exist in the database? Once again, I'll talk about that a little later. Now, the other things that I want to look at, I want to add in some other features that I find very useful. And one is an IEnumerable of T. And this becomes really handy if, in the cases of where we're looking at adding an array of IDs, for example. So let's imagine I'm on a website and I have a form and I have a bunch of checkboxes. Those checkboxes send in an array of strings, and the strings are generally IDs of some sort of value at the end. But what I can do here is, rather than in the controller having this iteration over this, I can put this down into the repository, which makes it a little bit more effective. And sometimes it's a feature that's just really beneficial. I use it quite often, and you may find it useful too. But we'll see how it implements out here, and you can choose to use it or not. Same is true with delete. There's quite a few times where, for example, I'm going to be creating this employees collection on a company entity, and before I delete that company, I may need to delete my employees too, or just at least delete that join table entry. So these are all things that we can do with these extra functions, and that'll allow a lot more flexibility. Okay, so let's look through what else we can do here. We have exists. That's fine. And you know what? You know what I'm going to do? I'm just going to take away the async, because it's really unnecessary. Just because all the other ones are here. I think that was a design change that I decided to implement in one of the videos. We don't really need it. Unnecessary. So I think we've got pretty much everything that we need to move forward. Now that we have this IBaseRepository, what I can do now is I can inherit my IBaseRepository T, and then I can get rid of some of these things, because several of these parts don't actually need are only related to the entities. They're not related to ID per se. All right, so we'll come down here. Now what we can do is the next step that we have to do is actually change our or upgrade our implementation of our base repository. And we're just going to take the lower level of that as well. This one, again, requires a few less things. Okay, and there we have it. Now, for our base repository with a key, we can do this. Okay, and now we have to implement some of the features that we require into our base repository. So there's a few things that we have to do to make this work. First of all, we can take this and push it up into our base repository. And because we're now inheriting the base repository, we actually don't need any interaction with context at this level. So that's going to show some errors, and that means that these are the things that I can move up to the upper level. So I'm going to take this add, I'm going to move it up. I see a delete with an entity, so I can move that up too. All right, exists, find, get, and get all. I can move those up. And remember, all of these functions are virtual. So when they're virtual, it means you can override their natural behavior, and that's an important thing to recognize. We'll move save changes up. And essentially, if you're noticing, everything that interacts directly with the context is moving down to that base repository. Now, here's one that's kind of interesting, because the update function calls this method here. It just sets the state to modified. Now, with Entity Framework Core, it was upgraded so that you could just simply call context.update, and it essentially does the same thing. So you could use this method or the update method. I'm going to move this up to the update method, but we're also going to make some upgrades as well, so that this method calls the base repository update. So hang in there while we do that. So we'll come back to that in a minute. All right, so let's implement all these missing interfaces here. All right, so our find is fairly straightforward. It actually looks much like the find up in this area, okay, or down in this area, I should say. So what we can do is going to implement something that's fairly similar, and it's going to look like this. Sorry, make some changes here. There we go. So we go context.find and keys, and it should, oops, I gotta put T, and that should do it. Yeah. All right, so that essentially does exactly what we're trying to aim for, and I kind of modified the wrong thing, but either way, we're going to go back into this find in just a second here. Now, before I got too far, the things that I also have to modify are making sure that these are all async and virtual. Remember, virtual allows us to override them, and change that while we're doing it. Okay. All right. So I think we're good here. Now, as I say, find, I got the wrong one last time, so I'm going to pull that up here. And for this find, what we're simply doing is this. We're just going to be saying something that looks very similar to the way this does. And because we now have this different naming here, we're going to simply return whatever it is. So whether it's if it's a null, doesn't matter at this level. We're just going to return whatever we find. Okay. All right, so we've updated our find, and once again, we can do the same thing that I was just mentioning there. We'll just return whatever is found, and that can be nullable too. At this level for this function, really all we're trying to do is add the new entity. So by this, all I'm implying here is that we're not doing anything extra to this point. But if you had to implement logic, so you would say implement updates here. And that update might look something like this: entity new dot name equals entity dot name. So we've seen this pattern before, and you could implement it at a very low level, which wouldn't be advisable at this point. But you'll see as we go up, there's 2 or 3 levels up that we actually go for this one before we actually make any changes. Now for this one, with the IEnumerable, this is very straightforward. It's just an iteration over entities, and then we await the add. And it's not entities, it's entity. Okay, so in this case, it's only just, all it's doing is just calling the add method. And the add method is, I'm going to move these up so that they're kind of grouped with the add methods, so we don't lose track of all the adds. Okay, so this here is just going to call this method right here. All right, and that method pushes it directly to the context. Now, you'll notice here as well, I went directly to the context. I actually should go something more like this too. That way, we're pushing that responsibility down to the add method to handle anything that relates to add. We don't need to do anything in this, of course, so we'll just avoid talking more about that. When we look down to the rest of the functions, this one here for update is another one that we need to do. And update very simply calls entity update in that way. And you can see it actually tells you right here that it applies it sets the state to modified. There's a few other things that it will do, but effectively that's really what it does, is it sets the state to modified so that the save changes will pick it up in the change tracker. Now going back down to here, one more, here is we very easily just call our await update, and we're sending the entity current into that. Okay, so although we do have a parameter for entity, we don't do anything with it. So it's very simple, very similar to the way the other one works in add. We're updating any entities here, entity properties here, and then pushing the new version down into the update function. With delete, we have a very similar function here that we did with add, and that is entities. There we go. Okay, and we want to await, and we're just sending it the delete method, just setting that entity right to delete. Delete. I'm going to move this up so that it's in line, and I'll move the updates as well. Okay, here we go. We have a find, that's 2 finds that should be up underneath get. And I like to organize things in a certain way so that all the getters are up top, the setters are in the middle. Okay, we'll move the update under add, and then exists I'll put as a function that is just under find. Okay, so that's another one that we have to check as well, and we can steal some code from down below here in our entity exists. I'm also going to make that change here so that it reflects everywhere else that uses it. There we go. So I'm going to take this code and I'm going to update the exists right here. And once again, that is very simply the entity. Okay. All right, so we now have functions that act at a lower level, and that's great. The functions that will come up to the top here, we are now going to send our weight through. Now, what is changing here is going to be entity. And one thing that I noticed here while I was looking at this code is, fortunately you're seeing this now, but this actually doesn't have to be find. It should actually be exists. So what it's going to be doing here is it's going off and seeing, does an entity with this ID exist? Now, the reason you want to do something more like this is you have less compute when you're just looking for an any. It's a smaller code to execute on your database, and of course that's going to be faster. That's at least the idea, is that it's going to be faster, and we're not returning an entire object to do that. All we're doing here is just, hey, does this actually exist here? If it doesn't exist, then we can't update anything. So just one more check to be sure that we're doing the right thing. Okay. Excellent. All right. So with that, let's do a little bit of reorging. I think this is pretty good. Delete is just up a little higher than I like. I like that being down at the bottom. Awesome. All right. So now that we have our updates in the repository, what I'm going to do next is look at the view controllers. Now, our view controllers, we have our companies. Now, companies has all of these handlers, and the one handler that we will look at within a couple minutes is our edit post find handler. And you'll see that any of the changes that it needs to do to the object are being made in the controller. Now, that's okay. There's nothing really wrong with that. But in order to make it truly repository driven, you need to move this statement down into the repository. And to do that, what we have to do is do some updates on our company's repository. So in our company's repository, we can do this. Now, one of the things I have to look at is, I have to go into our base user repository, actually. So let's just roll back a bit. We'll go into our base user repository because we actually have to implement some of our new interfaces in our base user repository. So let's do that right now. So we'll go to implement, and we do actually have a few things that will be missing here. And these are fairly straightforward to handle. So we can do it like this. So we do return repository find and entity. So a lot of them is very easy to do or easy to implement. The other thing that I'm going to do is just look through this repository and ensure that we have everything as virtual, and you can see none of them are, and that's why nothing's coming up as an override. So I'm going to do that right now. Let's just do our find and replace here, and we'll fix them all. We'll just go right ahead and remove all of them. Okay, we'll set that as virtual, and that is not async. That can also be virtual. All right, let's head down to the bottom here, and we'll just look at anything that is public task, and we'll ensure that they are all virtual and async. I think there's 3 or 4 of them here at least. A little bit more than 3 or 4. So there we go. Okay. We're all set up. Now the next thing that I need to do is ensure that everything is working with our repository. Now at this point here, I can also do this. You're going to see that there's a lot of things that are simply working with our repository here, but this one in particular, what we have to do here is a little bit more special. We have 2 functions that perform an add. Now, the add function can very simply look like this. Okay, we've got entity new. All right. Now, if there was any changes that had to happen in this point, of course, I can do those changes. If I needed to go down to the lower level and do those changes, I could also do that. So let's just understand what this add is doing here. So by doing this add, it sets the user context. So in the case of setting that user context, all it's doing is just setting the user ID and ensuring that it always has the proper user ID that has been set while we're in the context of the controller. It finally heads down into the repository, and that'll go down into the base repository, and then just pushes it to the data context. So there's some value in what we're doing here. The only difference is that we don't implement the lower level of that add function. Okay. You can if you have very specific requirements, but I'm not going to in this case. There's no real need to have it do that. And if I'm going to do that, I'm going to have it override the feature. I'm going to override the feature and implement something, because there's really only one line here, and I can easily implement that at a higher level. Now, down here, we can also do add and entities. Okay. Now, add with entities is, if you recall, it's going to iterate over a for each loop. That for each loop will inevitably come up to add at the top here and execute this set of functions. Okay, so we don't have to worry about it going down to the lower level. It's already going to be set here because it's an overridden function. All right. So let's do our update. And once again, fairly easy stuff. Nothing terribly complicated here. The update should also be working with our update for our user repository once again. And then once more, when we think about what our repository does down here, is we put in the entity current and entity once more. Now, once again, we have some choices here that we need to make. When something is being updated, we do kind of always want to ensure that the ensure user context is set. So I'm going to put that down to this lower level here. So in this context, I could do a couple choices. And for this one, I'm actually going to do that same choice where I'm just, in this context, I'm just going to call the update method, which then will call the user context and then head down into the lower level update. Okay. I could, if I had other logic, as I mentioned before, if I had other logic that required it to be down lower, I could certainly do that. All right, now our delete. Okay, so we have our delete, and we're going to add in entities. And find, or exists, I should say, is very simply, and this is actually repository dot exists, not itself. Sometimes you have to get a little careful when you're working in this way. You might get confused. Okay, so I think we have all of that correct now. Now we can actually go into our company's repository and do some of those overrides. So when we have an override here, what we're going to override is the add function, and we're also going to override the update. And you'll notice I'm specifically overriding these ones in particular. The idea here is that in the controller, for add, I'm creating a new entity, and I'm taking information from the outside, from the post data or the body. That's the request data that's coming in. I can perform all the updates that I need in this spot. So that means that if I have update new dot name equals, and I mentioned I did this example earlier, it looks like very similar to this. Okay, and same thing goes with our update over here. We can provide new information that's coming in from an entity from the outside and perform the updates that would be necessary. Okay, so let's go back and make some changes here for our controller so that it's also updated with the new information that we have. So when we look at the company's view controller, we don't really need this function here, this handler anymore. We don't need to override that because we're going to be pushing it down into the repository. Generally, and I say generally loosely because what you're looking to do, okay, in the context of deciding whether you want the controller to handle something or you want the repository to handle something, these are all choices that you make at this design time, because if the controller is very specific, in other words, maybe I've got companies to controller, and companies to controller acts slightly different than companies controller. This one here, maybe it sets the name, maybe company to sets the name and job title or something like that, or the phone number of the company. Some other function that would be worth that would be totally different, and that's really why you would have something different in the controller level. But because both of these controllers are working with the repository, they can always update the specific features that are necessary. So I can delete this up here now, and now I can go into our user controller and start to modify some of the things that are necessary here. Now, when we look at the way the create method goes, I have a model that's coming in from the body, and that calls the create pre-handler. The create pre-handler is over here. Actually, sorry, it is pre-add handler. I actually don't do anything with it, but I do handle model state, which is the appropriate things to handle in the controller. We also have the add method. Now, the add method at this point in a view controller doesn't have to be too creative. You can get away with not creating a new model, but when we get to the API controller, that's when things get a little different. So we can handle most of that stuff here. And if you see, when we looked into the implementation for company, you'll see that, and actually I want to do, sorry, I've actually made a change here that I shouldn't have. And let's just see here, company repository. This is the one that I should have had right here. in the head. Okay, there we go. So in this case, what I would naturally be doing is overriding the add function here. But because I actually am making an assumption that what's coming in from the contract, the context for the view controller, I'm assuming that model actually has the information in it. If it doesn't, something's going to error out, and that's not great, but it's also not terrible. So we can actually handle that error at some point. So there's not a lot of changes to make here. Next, if we go down to the edit function, this is actually where we start to make some other changes. So what we did here is we handled the edit post finder handler, and that's where we set our name come from the model coming in to the new name of the entity that's existing. So what we have here now is we can do repository.update. We have a current entity, and that is this, and the new model that's coming in. So we can just simply run that update and go ahead. As I mentioned, we still keep this handler because there are times when we need to do something slightly different than what the repository does. If you ever decided that, hey, wait a minute, I want to revert those changes, or maybe you need to make additional changes, you may want to put a handler in between the update and the save changes as well. I've done that many times too, and I really find these little triggers can be great actions that that can allow the developer to have more freedom to make changes as they need. So if I change this, I'm actually going to make this so that's a little bit more explicit. I can tell exactly what that is. All right, now let's go down here. We made this change, and I'm actually surprised it didn't correct it. And the ID is ID. It should not be giving me a problem. I see what I did wrong. I actually should have kept that exists and made it available down here with the T key, and don't know why I got rid of that. So let's be sure that we still have it. I'm pretty sure we're okay. Yeah, let's go down to our implementation. That should be in the base user repository. Okay, so we have to add that one. And exists. Okay. This is why it missed out. There we go. Okay. Okay, great. So now we have controller. There we are. Okay, we're fine. We're back up again. Sorry, folks. All right, and we'll go down to delete. We'll review what delete has. It is doing pretty much everything that we need. Once again, you could change this with you could add one more level where you check whether it exists or not. Again, less compute cycles. You're not using as much load on your database, because if you have a really large entity, you could be in for a lot of compute when you're pulling a lot of information from your database. So I think we're ready to test here. Let's go off and give it a try. Okay, so we're at our companies list. Let's just test if the update works. I'm pretty sure we've got an updatable feature here. We're good on that. We'll go to add a company, and 5, 6, 7, 8. And we're good there. We'll see if it still exists in the list, and it's right there. Let's make a quick update there. Good. All right. So all these features that we just implemented are still working. That is really an important feature that we want to consider here. And when we start looking at what these features do, and by the way, I don't know if you saw me just testing there. This is something that we have to address. And it's going to be something that I'll address in a later video. The reason this happens is because it's confusing namespaces. So we'll deal with that. I'm not that concerned about it, quite honestly, and we'll work on that in another set. All right. I hope you like this one, guys. We're getting really deep into forming good concepts and using best practices. Again, always like and share. Comment as often as you can. Be kind, be gentle. Love you all. Thanks a lot. Bye.